I'm actually more than delighted. I'm ecstatic to be able to show this audience how teachers can help students become really good thinkers, good, careful thinkers, and at the same time enhance their learning and learn how to do that themselves, not listen to somebody else who wants them to memorize things. So, transforming classrooms and schools by making thinking the basis of learning. And the word I like to use is infusing the teaching of thinking into content instruction. And I believe when we do that, we activate the potential that all students have to be good thinkers and good learners. So we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, now, I recognize that, even though that's a 1900 picture from a classroom, but when I went to school in the 1940s, okay, that was what my classroom looked like. And many teachers, now say, well, my classroom in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, okay, was like that too. But let's see the next slide, because things have changed. Okay, now many classrooms are different. And there's the teacher not saying anything. He's watching, moving around. And there are the students. They seem to be in small groups. Okay, and they're talking together and doing something. Okay, and they've got their backs to the teachers. Interesting. And of course, if this teacher sees something or a student says, how do I do this, or what should I do here? The teacher is going to help. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, and I just want to step back and I want to tell you what this kind of change is, because there's been a change from the I guess I want to say the center of the classroom. Okay, in previous years, students have been passive learners sitting in those seats. The teacher has been the center of the classroom, telling them what they have to learn, and they have to memorize it. Okay, now what we have done and what we find really works exceptionally well is to change the center of the classroom and make the students into active learners. So the teacher is not going to tell them what they have to learn. The teacher is going to help them learn how to learn those things. So let's move to the next one. Okay, and this is a little bit of elaboration. Teacher-centered, the students are passive. They listen to teachers lecturing. They read textbooks. They take notes. They identify and memorize what the teacher says is important. And then they have to give all that back to the teacher. Okay, so they take tests and they give back to the teacher what the teacher told them they had to memorize. And that's it. Of course, if they don't, they may have to stay back and do this all over again. Oh, horror of horrors. So these students are motivated to memorize, not because they're learning, but they want to get on to the next grade and the next grade and get out of school. On the other hand, student-centered classrooms, students are active. They're prompted by the teacher. They may find themselves relevant information. The teacher raises some questions for them, and they may look around, go to the school library, okay, and then they will use skillful thinking, okay, based on what they find to construct, record, okay, important content. So content learning, okay, when there's a teacher-centered classroom is based on memory. Content learning, when there's a student-centered classroom, is based on the students thinking and answering questions. What, how, why did this happen in the French Revolution? Whoa, we better find that out. And why do we think what is in this text that I'm reading is accurate? Okay, well, let's figure that out too. And that all involves thinking. And what they're learning gets into their heads, gets into their brains, and gets recorded there. And it stays there for the rest of their lives. And of course, the trick is to help them to learn to make decisions, solve problems, okay, in ways that enable them to access that information. They're not just going to think about things that they're learning right now. They're thinking about things that they've learned before, that they know, that's in their brains, and it's going to come out, and they're going to use that to make decisions and solve problems. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, now what I want to say, what I said in the previous slide, is that it's skillful thinking that the students do that is what motivates them to consider what they're learning important to learn. Okay, they're not just thinking about things that they're reading in their books. They're thinking carefully and skillfully, and that's revealing to them what the important stuff is and how, and they then have to get it into their heads. Well, go back now to our own experience, everybody's experience here, because there are lots of things we do and we learn, then we then learn to do them skillfully and well. You know, learn to play the piano. When I was a kid, my parents brought a piano teacher in and sat me down at the piano, and he said, play, and I made some noise. And he said, well, I'll teach you how to do that in a much better way so that what comes out of the piano is a beautiful melody. Well, he was teaching me how to play the piano with skill. And that's true of most of the things that we learn, the physical things that we learn. And here's an example, tennis. Okay, now the big thing is little kids are learning tennis. But here in the first picture, of course, this child doesn't know how to play tennis yet, but he already loves it. He loves the racket, loves the ball. But what does he do? Well, then there's a teacher who's going to come in and help this kid, well, it's another kid, but same thing, okay, learn how to use the racket to hit the ball, not just anywhere, but in a certain place. So they have to hold the racket a certain way, etc. So they're becoming skillful tennis players. And in the third picture, well, this student has learned all that, and he's playing tennis skillfully. Now, I just want you to think about that for a second. What's the difference between just hitting the ball and with the racket and playing tennis skillfully? It's in what the teacher here trains you, helps you learn to do. You're going to be doing certain things with the tennis racket, holding it at a certain angle, okay, swinging with a certain force, and that's what you're learning. So now let's think about thinking. What's involved when it's thinking we're concerned about? How do we make thinking skillful? Okay. Now, some people say, and we have to be very clear about this, thinking, what are the different kinds of thinking? Well, there's making decisions, solving problems, making predictions. Okay. Those are the thinking skills. That's wrong. If you make a decision and you're not doing it too well, and you make a stupid decision that you realize is the wrong decision, too bad, after you've made it, after you've suffered the consequences, well, that decision-making that you did was not a skill. You didn't do it skillfully. So what I want to do is to switch from a noun to an adverb. How can we learn to think skillfully? Let's not talk about a skill because that can confuse us. What do we have to do in our thinking to make it skillful? How can we make decisions skillfully? Let's switch the next slide. Okay. Well, now this is what I call, okay, helping students develop what is called a thinking map. I gave it that name. Why a thinking map? Because they're going to write down what they have to do when they're thinking, when they're deciding to do something, what they have to do that will make the thinking skillful, will make it something that was done carefully and well, and they can have some confidence that maybe what they decide to do is the right thing. They've thought it through carefully. So how do you get there? Right? Well, a lot of people, when they think about decision making, they realize they better think about the consequences of what they're considering before they decide to do that. So that's something. If you don't think about the consequences, you're going to be making decisions like a lot of people on this planet make without really thinking at all. You're just going to say, well, I'll do this. No, let's consider the consequences. That means you have to find out what the consequences are. And you have to remember to do that. What's going to help you to remember? Well, let's keep a question in our minds. Let's write it in our notebooks. Before we make a decision, we're going to ask, what will happen if I do that? Simple. And of course, we don't have to keep it in our notebooks very long because you're going to get that in your heads and you're going to do it automatically. Before you make a decision, you're going to not even say to yourself, wait, I have to stop and think about what will happen. You're just going to do it. Just like the tennis player doesn't say, I better hold the racket in this way, etc. No, the tennis player has practiced that enough so that he does it automatically when he sees the position of the other players. It's a kind of complicated eye-hand thinking, connection that goes on. Same with thinking. But are there any other questions that we need to ask and answer in order for the decision to be skillful? It's not just what's going to happen. For example, you start to think about a lot of people say, well, we better find out if what's going to happen is a good thing. If it's a bad thing, then maybe we shouldn't make the decision. So let's make our list of questions. And the result is a thinking map, what I call a thinking map. Let's go to the next one. This comes from the students. This came from a group of students in a classroom. Other students can come up with something that looks a little different. Now, I tell teachers, consider this co-construction, because if the students come up with a lot of questions, well, certainly we should think about our options. Let's get that down. But if they miss something that you think should be there, don't tell them, hey, you got it wrong, you got to put this there. No, say, I thought of something too. And I wonder if we add this, what do you think? Should that be there? And let the students, pass it back to the students. They're learning how to think for themselves and how to figure these things out. So a teacher might say, the students have come up with 1, 2, 3, and 5. Good ones, good questions. But I think maybe we should also ask, how important is the consequence? Because maybe we've got, a lot of good consequences and one bad one, but the bad one may be so important. Maybe it's going to involve the risk that somebody is going to lose their life if you make that decision. Well, maybe that's going to override a lot of good ones. So let's put that in. And then you're going to ask, what's the best option? There, you've thought through your decision with great care. So let's go on to the next. Now, once the students do this, they've got to remember, they can write them down in their notebooks or whatever, but the teacher says, probably not a good idea just to talk about it. And then tomorrow I'm going to say, do the same thing, and you're going to have to, scratch your head and try to remember. So let's put it somewhere. So this is now from a classroom in which the students have put the questions on the thinking map up on the wall so that tomorrow, well, if they've forgotten, these are the questions we came up with yesterday, so I'm going to use these. Hey, fine, save some time. Next, please. Now notice, the students are doing this themselves. But be careful, because the thinking map is not enough. Let's think about this violinist. Now, suppose this violinist has taken violin lessons, knows how to hold her fingers to get the best sound, how to make sure she's holding the bow properly, and that means she's lifted her arm so the bow won't go sideways and be squeaky. And she's learned all those things. Well, learning those things isn't enough. Learning the questions on the thinking map is not enough to be a good thinker. What does she have to do? She has to follow the instructions, and she has to play the violin remembering the instructions, and practice doing that enough so that it will become natural to play that way. In fact, she won't even have to ask herself, how should I do it? It'll be in her head and she'll do it automatically. Then she's become a good, maybe great violinist. Same with thinking. Okay. Now, what are the questions? Well, let's find out what the questions are. Let's follow the thinking map and ask them. So now we're making a decision. We're not just memorizing the thinking map to give it back on a test. Okay, we're doing it, and we're going to do it enough, practice it enough so that it becomes natural. You become a good decision maker, and you do it naturally. You don't even have to say to yourself, what should I think about? Let me just think about that. No, you do it. I remember going to a baseball game, okay, in the city of Boston, where I was born. I was a little kid, okay, and I watched especially the pitcher, the guy that throws the baseball to the other guy who's supposed to hit the baseball. And I noticed that the pitcher can pitch the ball, and it looks like it's going straight, but when it gets to the batter, it curves, and the batter swings and misses, okay? And so there was a little time after the baseball game when we kids could go and ask the baseball players questions. So I asked the pitcher, I said, how do you make that ball curve? And he looked at me and he said, I don't know. I don't remember. But I did know one time, and I did it, 50 times, 100 times, until I could do it automatically. And I don't have to ask myself, how should I do it? Well, that got me thinking, because as I got older, I learned how to drive a car. Same thing happened. The instructor says, well, turn the wheel just this much to park here. Okay, so I have to really watch it and turn just this much. But now I can do what's called parallel parking, where I'm beside another car and I'm backing in to a space without thinking about it. That's what we want to happen to all of the students we teach. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay. All right. Now, is this enough? Is coming up with a thinking map enough? Students are going to learn how to do it? Okay. And I already said the answer is no, of course. I mean, you can memorize what's on the thinking map, but you've got to do it. And now, how are you going to do it in the classroom? Well, that's the second little part of what I call thinking-based learning. And that is where you recognize as a teacher that there's a curriculum, okay? And that's beyond your control. And you've tried to teach students the content, okay, in the past. You've asked them to memorize things, but now you're going to ask them to use good thinking to think about what they're learning. And I will guarantee you that, you don't have to just take it from me, that the students will tell you, whoa, I learned so much more. I had so many questions that came up when I thought about, I thought I was trying to make a decision about, okay, what Napoleon should do, okay, when challenged by Wellington, and Napoleon realizes he doesn't have enough troops with him. What should he do? Well, okay, I've infused that into the content that my students are learning. And they're thinking about, they're asking questions. One student said, I wonder where Napoleon's other troops were. Could they get there fast enough? And the student said, I don't know, let's find out. So they did some research and they found out that, in fact, the relief that Napoleon could have called in to avoid a disastrous defeat was simply too far away to get there. And Napoleon would have to send somebody on horseback to tell them? Well, that takes more time. Okay, now to me, that's deeper and richer understanding, and you're doing it yourself because you're motivated. Next slide, please. Okay. So here is now a kind of a little bit of a structure. So number one, okay, that we worked on before was developing the thinking map. Now, okay, as the teacher, I'm going to start my students by raising some questions. I'll give them a thinking challenge. Do you think Napoleon could have called up his reserve troops fast enough? Okay, or whatever the question is. And then you're leaving it to the students. They're going to download in their heads the thinking map and try to answer that question. Okay. And they're not just going to do it orally because, you can talk about things today and tomorrow you forget. Okay. Unless you do it regularly, you may never forget if you practice it, but you need to do it. You need to write it down, practice it until it gets into your head. So there's going to be a special thing that this teacher is going to give the students, a graphic organizer, where they're not just they're going to know the questions from the thinking map, but they're going to answer the questions on the graphic organizer. So it's based on the thinking map. And you get a number of them for the different kinds of thinking that there are. And in fact, the students can try to construct some themselves, okay, to help them to organize their thinking. So let's go to the next step, please. Okay. Now we know that infusion in life, okay, it's in a lot of countries, is what the word we use when we make a cup of tea. You have water, hot water, and you have a tea bag with tea in it. Maybe you have a lemon, and you put the tea bag in the hot water, and the tea, okay, from the temperature of the water and the fact that it's wetting the tea leaves and the little bags, okay, becomes infused throughout the water, and you drink it, and wow, that's absolutely wonderful. Well, that's what happens in the classroom when you use infusion. Let's go to the next one. Okay. Now, what I've done here is, I'm sorry about the small print, okay, and I'm not going to read all of these, but I have written down some of the challenges that teachers have given to students so that they can infuse what they learn and write on the thinking map into their thinking about the content. One of them is, okay, Aztec civilization, parts of a whole. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, one of the types of thinking the students learn how to do well is to figure out when you have a whole thing and it's made up of parts, what the parts do. How does this thing work? Okay, you're not going to just take it for granted, press the button and let it go. Okay, because if one of the parts breaks, you need to fix it and you need to know what it's supposed to do. Okay, so Aztec civilization lasted for 300 years. And that's a long time for a civilization. What aspect of Aztec civilization helped it to survive all that time? Now, that's not a physical thing. I mean, there may be physical temples and what have you, but there's the religion, their economy. Okay, let's think about all those things and let's see if the way those things were structured helps us to understand how Aztec civilization as a civilization survived. Of course, there are other whole things. Okay, there are animals, how does this bird capture its prey when it's hovering, 30 meters above the ground? Okay, and if we watch it, it always gets its prey. How does that happen? Wow. Okay. So here are some others. Here's one that a secondary school, baccalaureate level physics teacher gave to his students. Okay, their cafeteria is notorious for the noise. It's terrible, and everybody complains about it. Well, how can we lower the noise in the cafeteria without restricting the freedom of the students to sit down and talk with friends over lunch? Students have said, I can't even hear the person sitting next to me. Whoa. And then not Napoleon and Waterloo, but President Truman did something to end World War II that to this day, many people don't agree with it. Suppose you were President Truman and you were trying to decide how to end World War II. And you know we had 2 atomic bombs, but you also know about the devastating effects of atomic bombs. An atomic bomb dropped on a city can kill 200,000 people, babies, old people. So you're thinking carefully. Well, you ask the students, I want you to become Harry Truman. And I want you to know what the situation was. Okay, you've learned about the Second World War. You learned about what the troops were trained to do, etc. Okay, and I want you to think through, do you have other options? Well, of course, we could invade. Well, what would be the consequence? I want you to think this through. We're going to take a week to do this. And I want you to learn as much as you can about the way things were during that period. Wow, what a great lesson for these older kids. But for younger kids, remember the story of Henny Penny? Pecking up corn in the barnyard, something hit her on the head. She said, whoa, the sky is falling. I must go and tell the king. And she rushed off to tell the king, followed now by Cocky Locky, Goosey Lucy, the other animals. Kids love this story. When Foxy Loxy comes along and he says, hey, Henny Penny, if you want to see the king, you're going the wrong way. You should go into this little hole. And the animals went in one by one. And as they went in, the children of the fox, who hadn't eaten in over a week, gobbled them all up as food. Now, let's go back. Let's read the story more carefully. And let's see if you were Henny Penny and you said, wait a minute, I'm not just going to jump to the conclusion that it's the sky. I'm going to try to figure out really what hit me on the head. Well, there are pictures in the book. There's a Henny Penny is under a tree. There are leaves falling. Well, wait a minute now. Last week, we learned about leaves. This is an oak tree. And oak trees have acorns. Maybe it was an acorn. And one of the kids put a picture of an acorn on Henny Penny's head. Well, okay, we're trying now to help these students learn how to decide what caused something. And we know when that's a question, and it's important, what caused the accident, let's find out, because we don't want it to happen again if we have to fix something. So let's take that seriously. And you can start little kids learning this. Now, from my point of view, what I've seen, start with infants, 3-year-old kids. Okay, they are little great thinkers if you catch them. Of course, they don't know what the older kids know, but you got examples, okay, that they're familiar with. And you can structure good starter lessons from them so that as they go up through the grades and they practice and learn more, they will get more and more sophisticated. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, here are some other examples. Okay, and you know this, people are grappling with, have been for years. What's the best alternative energy source? Or is there a better source than coal or oil? Okay, well, let's think about that carefully and try to make a decision. Okay, the bees, how can we save the bees? Well, you can't figure that overnight, but let's take a few days. Let's try to find out. Okay, and let's see if we can make a good decision. And the book, well, that's about a little girl, and this is translated into Spanish from the USA, and it won a prize in the USA, Charlotte's Web. I'm not going to say much about it, except that on the first page, she has a little conflict with her father. And he has to decide what to do. Okay, so we have reading, we have science, we have social studies, and much more. Go on to the next, please. So the context is there. Now, I'm just going to flash this up because I just wanted to show you the 4 domains of thinking that students and the teacher usually come up with as important to learn how to do well. Okay, there's creative thinking, coming up with good original ideas that work. Okay, metaphor. Okay, creating a metaphor. Okay, now that there you can express yourself in non-literal language, and you can carry along with it all sorts of feelings, excitement, etc. Then on the right-hand side, clarifying ideas, well, analyzing things. Like I said, parts of a whole worked. And then the domain of critical thinking, deciding how reasonable the ideas are. Okay, well, we get information from observation from other people. Should we trust it? Okay, is the information reliable? Let's learn how to figure that out and use our critical thinking. And then what I call inference, that is, make predictions. Well, let's be careful. Let's see if we can figure out whether these predictions are well supported, whether we have reasons to think these predictions are going to happen, and finding causes. And then finally, to action-oriented types of thinking, making decisions and solving problems. Now, in a school, when I work with a school, I work with the teachers, and they work on all of these with the students. Okay, we certify schools as TBL schools, thinking-based learning schools. Okay, and they have from infants to baccalaureate to help these students learn how to do all of these things well and do them naturally. Next slide, please. Okay, here's one about nature. Okay, there's a bear, caught a fish. Okay, now this area in the natural world has remained pretty much the same for many, many years. How come? Trees, as you can see, the trees are dying. Why don't they all die? And then this won't really be what it is now. And what about the fish? Okay, next year, the year after, 20 years from now, will there be fish in the stream for the descendants of this bear to catch? All right, so that's parts of a whole. This is a whole thing. What are the different components here that contribute to the ability of this piece of nature to survive for so many years? Okay, next one. Okay, so parts of a whole. How do the parts work together in this ecosystem? Okay, now that's the challenge for the students. And be precise and decisive. Next slide, please. That's the thinking map. Easy. And everything in the universe has parts. Next, please. And here's the graphic organizer these kids are going to use. The whole object, what are the parts? Then let's pick one of the parts. Let's ask what would happen if it wasn't there. And let's let that help us to figure out what it does when it is there. Whoa. This was something that a group of children came up with in a 6th grade classroom way back in the middle 1980s when we were first starting this. And many, many other classrooms love it, although sometimes they make it a little differently. Next, please. So graphic organizers, here's, a process. Start on the left, thinking map. Then let's get a challenge. Okay, that's this part of nature that they're thinking about. That's the whole object. Students working together, not sitting in rows. Okay, looking at this picture of this natural piece of the earth and writing things down on a graphic board. Teacher walking around, watching what they do, and then the students showing the other students in the classroom, because they're all working on this. Let's compare notes with the other group that's working. Let's not compete with each other. We form a team of thinkers. And so does the classroom. Let's compare everything we found, and maybe we'll make a big graphic organizer, put it on the wall, and we'll synthesize everything. Next. Okay. And here are some kids, happy, working together. Now, working in teams, collaborative thinking, not yet collaborative learning, but collaborative thinking. Very, very important. If you think about it, the thinking that goes on in this world that you do, et cetera, you're not a hermit, okay? In your family, your kids suggest something, okay? And one child may suggest something that the other child disagrees with, so they have a little back and forth. But working together as a team, okay, that's the best way to do good thinking. Let's see the next one. Next slide, please. Now, this doesn't just happen in, the USA or in Spain, where I am now located. Okay, this is a classroom in Amman, Jordan. And I got invited there to talk to teachers about how this all works, because they too were feeling old-fashioned schooling, memorization, that's not going to help these kids. They need to learn how to think carefully and well, share their ideas. And this is a teacher helping the students. Next, please. Okay. And this is in a Spanish classroom. Okay, these are two classrooms. The one on the left, a group of 3 students working together. And then I took this picture. I was able to see that there's one student who is the scribe, who the other students talk to, and that first student writes down on the graphic organizer what they've all come up with. And in the lower right, well, that's another group doing the same thing, working together. And I will tell you that the kids love it, and what comes out of it is absolutely phenomenal. Just imagine. Next slide, please. Here's another example. This is decision making. It's a different graphic organizer, different kids on the left, different kids on the right doing the same thing. Okay? And the same for all of those other kinds of thinking. And imagine if every school in the world did this, and all the students learned how to think well and carefully, what they needed to find out to feel confident that their ideas were good ideas. Okay, imagine what this world would be like. All right, let's go on to the next one. Okay. And this is from a classroom in the city of Vitoria in Spain. And these are little kids. Bring it down to infants, 2, 3, 4-year-old kids. Many people say they can't do it. Oh, but that's wrong. It's just that you try to get them to think about something they don't know anything about. Well, that's not going to work, but they know plenty about a lot of things, okay, when they're young, and you can figure that out, okay, and help them. Next, please. And there's that bird. We call it in the US the kestrel. It's called a sonicolo in Spain. Next, please. And it's a hunter. Same thing, graphic organizer, parts of a whole. Now I'll show you some detail from the kids. Next. Parts, don't just write one part in the parts box. Let's write the big parts on the top. Okay, you can do it that way. You can do it any way you want. But then let's ask wings, what are the parts of the wings? And you may ask, what are the parts of the feathers? Hey, then you'll need a different graphic organizer. Next, please. These come from the kids. Okay, now what would happen if the part was missing? Next, please. Okay, Well, I just want you to read. I'm going to read it to you because they were considering the left eye. What's the role of the left eye in the hunting of the bird? Well, while hovering above the prey that it spotted, the bird wouldn't be able to determine its distance from the prey. Okay, and that distance separates it from the prey. It wouldn't be able to figure that out if it had only one eye. So it wouldn't be able to calculate how far it would have to dive to capture the prey. When it dove, it might miss or injure itself. Okay. So the bird depends on, hunting its prey for food, bringing food to its chicks. Well, it might eventually become sick and starve to death. Whoa. This came from a group of third grade children. Okay. Now, of course, the wording, the teacher helped them and made it more sophisticated, but hey, amazing. Next. Okay, now, where did the students get this information? Aha. This teacher and all the other teachers that do TBL knows how to prompt them so that they search in their minds about what they've seen on TV, what people have said, not necessarily about this bird, but about birds and birds hunting. Okay, next. I just want to repeat that again. So what's the function? Next. Well, both eyes work together to provide the kestrel with good vision and keen depth perception, etc., etc. This is just the positive version of the negatives in what would happen if it didn't have a left eye. So that really guides the students, works wonderfully in helping them come to a conclusion. Next. And here's just a copy of the whole graphic organizer. That comes from the class. Maybe in one group, another group, it had something similar, but then they compared notes, they added some things, they eliminated the redundancies. Okay, fantastic. Next. Now, little kids, they can't write. They're not going to be able to do that. What do? Well, here are some little kids. They may be 3 years old, maybe 4, I'm not sure. But there's the graphic organizer for parts of a whole. And this teacher has just said to the kids, hey, I have parts of my body. Look at my head. I have a head. And the students looked at it and she said, and it has parts too. I wonder what the parts are. Next slide. So she gave them mirrors and said, look at your faces. Let's see what the parts of your faces are. And then, next slide, please, we'll go up and we'll put it on the graphic organizer. Okay, and there's a kid who comes up and draws a picture. They can't write, but they can draw pictures. Next slide. Okay, all the way to the end. Next slide. Well, there they are. Wow. And they talk about it a little bit. The teacher may write some things down that you'll read to them that they say a little later. But hey, adapt to the kids and what they can do, but it's the same basic idea. Next slide. Okay. Now, is this working? You want the students to say to themselves, let's stop and think about how we're doing our thinking. Did we miss something? Well, let's be careful. What kind of thinking was this? How did you do it? Did it work? Did you miss something? You're not satisfied? Okay. And if it didn't work, how would you change the way you do it? Now, if these kids are following the thinking map, okay, well, they're going up what we call the ladder of metacognition, something that a colleague and I sort of invented, okay, to put those questions in an interesting way for the students to start to realize that, they can figure out for themselves whether they're doing something and it's working. Maybe they've missed a whole bunch of questions. Maybe not. Next slide. Okay. Now here is a teacher, okay, that was in one of my workshops who had this wonderful skill of being able to draw these diagrams. And number one on the left, that's the first step, what kind of thinking? Okay, then the student sitting down on the right, how did I do it? And then the number three on the left, hey, it worked well, I did it well. And then another student going up the ladder saying, well, let me think about it some more. Maybe I should do it a different way. Now think about that, number three. Think about what would happen if you then said to the students, now go over the top of the ladder and come up with another example that you're going to use this kind of thinking for, okay, and do it yourselves. Because I don't want you to, I'm not going to be around in your life when you have to think about something like this. And you can't call me up on the phone and say, what's the third question on the thinking map? So you're going to have to get used to it and practice it and do it yourself. Next. Now, for little kids, little great thinkers, well, you ask them, okay, when it's recess time and you go out into the playground, what are the things you think about? How do you figure out what you're going to do? And this came from a group of students in an infant's classroom. What are some things I can do? Now, of course, these kids could speak. So maybe fourth grade, fifth grade. Okay, doesn't matter. But this is their thinking map, and this is the one they're going to use. When they go up through the grades, it's going to get more sophisticated. But what are some of the things I can do? What'll happen if I do them? And which are the good ones? The essence. But you need to get a little more sophisticated as you move or get older and learn more. Things get a little more subtle. So there's not one thinking map, and it varies, and it is based on what the kids say. Next, please. Okay. And there's a graphic organizer for choosing. Okay, what could I do? Well, the teacher, if the students can't write, the teacher will write on the top. And what will happen? And then what are the pros? What are the good things and what are the bad things? So it's a little more prescribed based on the help that the kids need, but still they're learning the basic strategy. Next. And this, believe it or not, this is the ladder of metacognition for little kids. Now you wonder, how little? Well, these images, the teacher made them so that when the kids are answering the question, what kind of thinking, their images are on the bottom, but they can pick them up and they can move them up the ladder. So they want to do it. Now, I have a picture of these kids in the classroom. I couldn't find it in my slides, but I have it on my wall and I'm going to show it to you. Okay, so I don't know if you can see it, but that's the classroom and that's me there with them. And they're learning to be good thinkers and they're learning how to monitor their own thinking. Now, I want to say monitoring their own thinking, that's something that we also do with other things we do. You bake a chocolate cake, you follow a recipe, put it in the oven, turn the oven to, 575 degrees, okay, and you wait a little while, you open the oven and whoa, ashes. Something went wrong. So you go back to the cookbook and you look at it and you see it says 375, not 570. You read the cookbook wrong. You got to do it again differently. And any good teacher who's teaching the students things that involve physical activity, a carpentry teacher, a swimming teacher, okay? Well, it's the same thing. They use the same kind of prompts to get the students to think, and pretty soon the teacher is going to say, You do it yourself. Imagine teaching the kids how to monitor, decide whether they're doing something well, okay, and not be afraid to say, no, it didn't work. Well, I know how to do it differently, though, or discuss it in the class. Next, please. Okay. And then, again, I said, here is a student from one of the groups. They've gone through all of this, and they're posting what they came up with so that the other students can see, and they're going to have a discussion with the other groups in the classroom. Next. Okay, here's another one. This is from a school in Chile. Okay, I actually forget the name of the school or the town, but I remember. And this student was the leader in his group, and he's explaining what his group came up with. They have a slightly different graphic organizer. That's okay. All right. And the other kids are listening. They're writing things down. Other groups may want to add things that they missed, or they may object and they argue about it. Good. That's how thinking should work. Next. And there they are. Now, this isn't everybody. This is one classroom. And I had somebody take this picture because these kids loved it. And they're little kids. And they're going to love it and love it and love it as they get older and older. And they're going to learn how to do it in the most sophisticated ways. Okay. And they are not only going to love it, their love of it is going to make them want to do it. I want to do thinking this way. I want to do good thinking. Wonderful. Next slide, please. Now, I'm just going to summarize a few things because, okay, there are really 4 steps in this process, and I have slurred them together. Step 1 at the bottom, well, they have to develop a thinking map. They haven't thought about how to do this kind of thinking. They make mistakes all the time. Okay, step 2, well, let's use it again, but we don't have to develop it again. It's up there on the wall. Let's keep it posted. Okay, so let's try to remember it, use it. Okay, but step 3, now I'm going to move away. I'm going to take the thinking map off the wall. I'm going to, not give you any graphic organizers, and I'm going to ask you to do this next one yourself. And I want you to assess yourself. So I'll prompt you. I'll give you some ideas about what kind of lesson you might do, but you're going to do it yourself. And step 4, well, teachers aren't around. You've learned. You're out there in the world. Something happens. You say, oh, my God, okay, I've got to decide what to do. And I better use some good, skillful decision making because this was an auto accident and somebody's there bleeding. Okay, and I know something about that, but what should I do? Should I call a doctor? Okay, should I try to bandage the wound myself? Whoa, but you're not even saying those things to yourself. You're just doing it because you've done it so many times, you practice it. Okay, it's like playing the violin. Next. And I've just put these now horizontally, these 4 steps, but I want to emphasize number 5. It's like that baseball player, the pitcher. Self-motivated, self-cued. You know what kind of thinking is involved. You guide yourself in the thinking yourself. And you do all that without thinking about it, without asking, what should I do next? Okay, how can I come up with these ideas, etc. This becomes a natural thing to do. Next. Let's go back to the violin. Okay, because that's what this violin player is doing. Now imagine her up on the stage. Now she's not dressed up, okay, with a flower in her hair, etc. The audience, appropriate for the audience, but she is playing the violin for an audience. And it's wonderful. They all love it. And at certain points, it makes them cry in the audience. Well, skillful violin playing into action without having to ask, how should I keep my fingers, etc. Thinking is the same. Next. Okay. So TBL for PBL. Well, PBL is problem-based learning or project-based learning. And it's a new thing, and it's sweeping the educational world, where you pose problems for students, like the problem of energy sources. That's not something you're going to think about and figure out in one day. So let's make it a project. I'll give you, maybe 3 weeks, and you'll work together in your teams. And that's what you're going to be learning about. You're going to have to get information, et cetera, et cetera. And that goes on, et cetera. But a lot of times TBL isn't involved. The students aren't really thinking. They don't know how to really figure things out so that they've really done this as well as anybody could. TBL for PBL. Next slide. And I'll just show you. Well, now there are 3 contexts in which teachers have embedded thinking skills, into extended problems and projects. Real world problems like the bees, like energy sources, projects that call for action. We've got to do something. Or rethinking controversial problems like you're Harry Truman. That's already happened. But if you were there, what would your decision be? And then hypothetical problems that come up, projects. Well, that blends into some science fiction. Not just fantasy, but science fiction. Let's make sure that the facts are there. But this is now a new kind of problem that you're trying to solve. Next slide. The bees. Back to the bees. Next slide. Now, well, let's go back. Go back one. Okay. Can you do that? Okay. Now, you all must know about the bees. Okay. The bees are dying. Something's happening. And people are worried because it looks like someday soon, they may become extinct. And that may be serious. It depends on what the bees do that helps us. Now, of course, there's honey. So maybe we're not going to have any honey anymore, but that's not a big thing. But let's think about this. Next slide, please. Okay. So what are we going to think about? Well, what's causing the bees to die? Maybe we can solve this problem by eliminating the cause like we've done with diseases for humans. Maybe not. What can you predict is going to happen if the bees, to other living things, if the bees die? Many people say the bees pollinate plants that give us vegetables. And maybe we're going to be in some trouble without the bees. Okay. So what would a decrease in bee population happen? What would that bring about? Let's make some predictions. And let's try to find some remedies and try to predict what's going to happen if we use them. And let's come up with some creative solutions. Because we can compare and contrast different solutions, and we're going to decide what the best one is. No, go back. And then we have to gather information. Go back. So this is thinking, TBL, thinking-based learning, put into a project that teachers have been asking students to be involved in without their having the skills to really think all this stuff through. Think about how wonderful it would be if all these projects included thinking. And there are many that do. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a school, Colegio Montserrat in Barcelona, Spain. The school owned a piece of land next to the school, and it was getting overgrown with weeds. And the principal decided to give it to a group of students and ask them, to turn it into something useful. And they decided to make it into a park for handicapped kids, with slides they could use. But of course, they had to figure out how to adjust them to make them work for handicapped kids. et cetera, et cetera. It's a wonderful example. And these kids, these were now secondary school students, and these kids did a fantastic job, and they wrote it up in a booklet. Okay, next slide, please. So together now, it's not just one student. It's a whole bunch of students who have become good thinkers. They're going to create a symphony of good thinking. Next slide, please. So with that, I end, but it's not the end. Now, you in the audience, I've said a lot, told you a lot of things that you, if you're a teacher, you can do yourselves. You can learn how to do it. There are plenty of workshops that are given. We give workshops. Okay. There are schools that are thinking-based learning schools. And if you're interested, come to me and I'll try to set you up with a school near you that you can go visit. I mean, there's a lot you can do. But remember, all students can become good thinkers and good learners. It's not true that some students are born smart, gifted, and the others not, and they never will be. And they have to do the memorizing, the others are the leaders. No. All students can become good thinkers and good learners, and you can do it. Thank you. Actually, it's been a wonderful pleasure to talk to an audience that I can't see, okay, because it doesn't matter. I get myself all worked up too. So thank you for listening.